Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. This video analyzes historical trends, social data, and economic history related to the Great Depression and marital demographics. It does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Laws regarding marriage and divorce have changed significantly since the 1930s, and any modern application of these historical case studies should be conducted with your own due diligence and the consultation of qualified professionals in your specific jurisdiction. In 1932, at the absolute nadir of the Great Depression, the United States was witnessing a phenomenon that defied every logic of human emotion. People who absolutely loathed one another were being forced into a state of permanent, agonizing proximity. You have probably heard the romanticized version of history, that hard times bring families together, that the shared struggle of the breadline forged unbreakable bonds in the American hearth. But the data tells a much darker, much more complicated story. During the greatest economic collapse in modern history, the divorce rate in the United States actually plummeted. On paper, it looked like American marriages were stronger than ever. In reality, the country was a pressure cooker of invisible divorces. Tens of thousands of couples were trapped in a legal and financial cage, unable to afford the exit fee of a failed relationship. We are talking about families living in one-room tenements where the husband and wife hadn't spoken a word to each other in 3 years. Yet they shared a bed because a second mattress was a luxury they couldn't afford. This was the era of the poor man's divorce, a time when men simply walked out the door and never came back because a legal filing cost more than 6 months of groceries. Today, as we look at shifting economic indicators and the rising cost of living, understanding this historical trend is more than just a history lesson. It is a roadmap for survival. This video is a deep dive masterclass into the divorce now trend of the 1930s, exploring how economic paralysis reshaped the American family unit. By the end of this series, you will understand exactly how financial shifts dictate domestic reality, the hidden costs of staying for the sake of the economy, and the specific historical case studies that show us what happens to society when the exit door of marriage is locked by the bank. If you have ever felt that your personal life is at the mercy of the stock market, this analysis is for you. To understand why the divorce rate dropped during the Great Depression, we first have to look at the Roaring Twenties that preceded it. The 1920s were a period of unprecedented social liberation. For the first time, women were entering the workforce in significant numbers, the 19th Amendment had granted the right to vote, and the concept of companionate marriage, the idea that you should actually like the person you married, was becoming the cultural standard. Divorce rates had been steadily climbing throughout the 1920s as social stigmas began to erode. People were beginning to view marriage not as a permanent property contract, but as a path to personal happiness. Then, October 1929 happened. The stock market crash didn't just wipe out savings, it froze social mobility. By 1930, the cost of a legal divorce in many U.S. states ranged from $50 to $500. In an era where the average annual income was rapidly dropping toward $1,500, and where millions were earning zero, the legal fee to end a marriage became an insurmountable barrier. This created a massive discrepancy between the desire to divorce and the ability to divorce. Historical trends indicate that while formal filings decreased, domestic discord reached an all-time high. Let's look at a specific case study from the Chicago Municipal Courts in 1931. Records show a massive spike in separate maintenance filings, essentially legal separations where the couple lived apart but remained married. Why? Because a full divorce required a division of assets and a settlement that neither party could provide. If a couple owned a home that had lost 60% of its value, selling it to split the proceeds was a suicide mission. They were underwater in their mortgage and underwater in their relationship. The result was a generation of Americans living in what sociologists call hollow shells. The poor man's divorce became the primary solution for the working class. This is a term used by historians to describe desertion. When the financial pressure of maintaining a household became too great, and the legal fees of a divorce were out of reach, thousands of men simply vanished. They joined the ranks of the transient population, riding the rails as hobos or moving to distant cities to start over under different names. For the women left behind, this was a catastrophe. Without a legal divorce, they could not remarry for financial support, and they often could not claim any remaining assets or government relief. In 1934, it was estimated that there were over 1.5 million abandoned wives in the United States. These women were legally married to ghosts, trapped in a limbo state that the official divorce statistics of the time completely failed to capture. Furthermore, we have to examine the role of migratory divorce. For the wealthy, the Great Depression was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was a prison. This created a massive class divide in the divorce now trend. While the average American was stuck in a miserable kitchen in Ohio, the wealthy elite were boarding trains to Reno, Nevada. Nevada had realized that divorce could be a lucrative industry. By 1931, they lowered the residency requirement to just 6 weeks. If you had the money for a train ticket and 6 weeks of lodging in a divorce ranch, you could get a decree with no questions asked. This Reno cure became a symbol of the economic disparity of the era. It shows us that in times of economic crisis, freedom becomes a luxury good. The psychological impact of this trend cannot be overstated. When we analyze the potential outcomes of being trapped in a high-stress environment, we see a direct correlation between the frozen divorce rate and a spike in domestic volatility. Case studies from social workers in New York City during the mid-1930s describe the Great Depression temperament. Men, stripped of their roles as providers, often lashed out at their families. Women, feeling the double burden of managing a starving household while enduring a failing marriage, suffered from unprecedented levels of clinical nervous breakdowns, as they were called then. This deep dive is essential because we are seeing similar patterns emerge in modern cycles. When the housing market stalls or inflation outpaces wages, the divorce now trend doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. People start living apart together, or cohabitating long after the romance has died because the math of moving out doesn't add up. By studying the 1930s, we can see the step-by-step breakdown of how economic pressure overrides personal autonomy. We will look at how the government eventually had to step in with the New Deal, not just to provide jobs, but to provide the social services that handled the fallout of millions of fractured, yet legally bound families. We are going to explore the specific data points. The 25% unemployment rate versus the 20% drop in divorce filings, and why that 5% gap represents the most miserable segment of the American population. We will analyze the desertion bureaus that were set up to track down runaway husbands, and how the concept of alimony was practically reinvented during this decade, because there was simply no money to be had. This is the story of how the dollar bill became the ultimate arbiter of the American heart. To understand the sheer magnitude of the economic cage that replaced the American home in the early 1930s, we have to look at the granular math of survival. Imagine if you are living in the year 2026, and the cost of your basic necessities has skyrocketed while your income has vanished, but the legal fee to exit a toxic relationship remains fixed at a price you could only dream of affording. In 1932, this was the standard reality for millions of Americans. The financial barrier to entry into a new life was so high that marriage became a forced economic cooperative, rather than a romantic union. To see how this functioned on the ground, let us analyze a specific case study from the industrial heartland, focusing on a typical worker we will call James. James was a steelworker in Pittsburgh who, by 1931, had seen his hours cut from 48 per week to just 12. His wife, Martha, had previously been a homemaker, a common role in the pre-Depression era. Their relationship had been fracturing for years, characterized by the type of mounting resentment that usually ends in a courtroom. However, a legal divorce in Pennsylvania at that time required not just a filing fee, but the hiring of counsel and, often, the procurement of witnesses to prove fault, such as extreme cruelty or desertion. The total cost could easily exceed $100. In a year where James was lucky to bring home $8 a week, that $100 represented over 3 months of gross income, excluding the costs of rent, coal for heat, and flour. James and Martha entered what historians now call a state of frozen conflict. They could not afford to live together, but they absolutely could not afford to live apart. To understand the step-by-step degradation of the domestic sphere during this trend, we have to look at the housing crisis within the home. When a couple divorces, they traditionally require 2 separate residences. In 1932, the vacancy rates in major cities were low not because people were thriving, but because families were doubling and tripling up in single-family dwellings to avoid the Hoovervilles. If James moved out, he would have to pay rent on a new room. If Martha stayed, she had no income to pay the existing rent. The potential outcomes were binary: stay and suffer in silence, or leave and face literal starvation. This led to the rise of the border phenomenon, a desperate economic strategy that added a layer of complexity to these failing marriages. To bridge the gap in their rent, couples who essentially hated each other would take in a third party, a stranger who rented a couch or a spare bed. Imagine the psychological toll of trying to maintain the facade of a functional marriage in a 400-square-foot apartment, while a stranger watches your every argument. Historical trends show that this was not an isolated occurrence. In some urban centers, nearly 30% of households took in lodgers. This third person acted as a financial band-aid that effectively stitched a dead marriage back together. It created a bizarre social dynamic where the presence of a stranger actually prevented the divorce now trend from manifesting legally, even as it accelerated the emotional decay of the couple. We must also look at the legal wall constructed by the states. During the Great Depression, divorce laws in the United States were a patchwork of archaic fault-based statutes. In New York, for example, the only legal ground for divorce was adultery. This meant that even if James and Martha both agreed they wanted out, they had to provide proof of an affair. This led to a clandestine industry of staged infidelities. A couple would hire a professional correspondent, usually a woman who was paid to be photographed in a hotel room with the husband, and a photographer to burst in and document the evidence. But here is the catch. Even a staged divorce cost money. You had to pay the girl, you had to pay the photographer, and you had to pay the lawyer to present the fraudulent evidence to a judge who often looked the other way. If you were part of the 25% of Americans who were unemployed, this exit strategy was as out of reach as a trip to the moon. The gender trap of this era added another layer of depth to the staying trend. For a woman in 1933, the divorce now option was often a death sentence for her social and financial standing. Even if she managed to get a decree, the likelihood of receiving alimony was nearly zero. The courts could order a man to pay, but you cannot extract blood from a stone. If the husband was unemployed, the court order was a useless piece of paper. This created a generation of women who were legally married but functionally abandoned within their own homes. They became internal refugees, navigating a house where the husband provided no income and no emotional support. Yet they were bound to him by a legal system that demanded a fee they couldn't pay to grant them a freedom they couldn't afford to use. Consider the imagine-if scenario for the current year. Imagine if in 2026, the government mandated that you could only divorce if you could prove you had $50,000 in a savings account. That is the modern equivalent of the financial wall faced by Depression-era couples. The result is a society of hollow shells. We see this in the data from the Family Service Association of America, which noted a massive surge in psychological desertion during the mid-1930s. This is a state where the couple ceases all intimacy, all shared meals, and all constructive communication, yet they continue to share a roof. They become two ghosts haunting the same hallways. As the 1930s progressed, this pressure cooker began to vent in dangerous ways. We began to see a rise in domestic volatility that the legal system was ill-equipped to handle. Since the exit door was locked, the internal pressure intensified. This period saw a shift in how social workers viewed the American family. They stopped seeing the home as a sanctuary and started seeing it as a site of potential trauma induced by economic paralysis. This is where we see the reinvention of alimony and the poor man's divorce mentioned previously, where the law had to adapt to a reality where no one had any money. The courts started issuing $1 alimony orders, not because the woman didn't need more, but to keep the legal obligation active in the hope that the husband might one day find a job. It was a legal placeholder for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely. The story of the Great Depression's divorce trend is not a story of people choosing to stay together because of some lost era of moral fortitude. It is a story of a population that was legally and financially kidnapped by their own circumstances. We have explored the cost of the filing fees, the nightmare of the border dynamic, and the fraudulent industry of staged adultery. But what happens when the state realizes that this domestic stagnation is actually hurting the national recovery? What happens when the New Deal enters the bedroom? In the next part, we are going to look at the shocking way the U.S. government attempted to stabilize the American family through the first massive welfare programs, and how these programs actually made it even harder for women to leave failing marriages. We will uncover the hidden morality clauses of the 1930s relief checks that forced couples back into the same house just to qualify for a bag of flour. If you think the invisible divorce was bad, wait until you see what happened when the government started paying people to stay miserable. By 1935, the United States government had realized that the economic collapse was not just a banking crisis. It was a sociological catastrophe that threatened the very structure of the American family. To address this, the New Deal introduced a wave of relief programs that, while intended to save lives, inadvertently created a system of economic coercion that made divorce a functional impossibility for the working class. Let us look at the Federal Emergency Relief Administration and the subsequent aid to dependent children, which was part of the landmark Social Security Act of 1935. These programs were the first time the federal government stepped directly into the living rooms of millions of citizens, and they brought with them a rigid set of moral and social standards that prioritized the preservation of the nuclear family over the personal safety or happiness of the individuals within it. Imagine if, in the current year 2026, the government issued a digital stimulus package that was only accessible if your smartphone's GPS tracked you and your estranged spouse in the same residential square footage for 22 hours a day. During the Great Depression, the equivalent of this was the home visit by a social worker. For a woman we will call Sarah, living in a cramped apartment in Chicago in 1935, the arrival of the relief investigator was a moment of extreme high stakes. Sarah and her husband, Michael, had effectively ended their relationship 3 years prior. Michael was frequently absent, often drinking away what little money he earned from occasional day labor, and their home had become a place of constant verbal and physical friction. Under normal economic circumstances, Sarah would have sought a legal separation. But in 1935, Sarah's survival depended on the ADC check. Historical trends during this period reveal a chilling reality. Relief was often contingent on the presence of a suitable home. The definition of suitable was left almost entirely to the discretion of local social workers, who were often influenced by the prevailing social conservative values of the era. If Sarah moved out or filed for divorce, she was immediately flagged as a broken home risk. In many jurisdictions, being a divorced woman was seen as a sign of moral instability, which could lead to a denial of benefits or, even worse, the removal of her children by the state. The potential outcomes for Sarah were clear. She could either stay in a toxic, failing marriage and receive the state-funded groceries and coal, or she could seek her freedom and face the very real possibility of losing her children to the foster care system or the poorhouse. Created what sociologists call the welfare lock. The government was essentially subsidizing the invisible divorce we discussed earlier. By providing aid that was tied to a traditional household structure, the New Deal acted as a massive financial anchor that kept failing marriages from drifting apart. Case studies from the era show that many women intentionally hid their husbands' desertions or their own desires for divorce from social workers. They would keep a man's coat hanging by the door and his boots in the hallway even if he had been gone for months, just to ensure that when the investigator looked inside, they saw a complete family unit worthy of government support. Furthermore, we must analyze the specific mechanism of the man-in-the-house rules that began to take root during this era. While these rules became more infamous in the 1960s, their DNA was written into the Great Depression's relief psyche. The logic was simple. If there was a man in the house, he was responsible for the financial support of the family, regardless of whether he was actually contributing or even employed. If a woman like Sarah wanted to divorce Michael and move in with her sister or another supportive relative, the state would often view any man in that new household, even a brother or a father, as a reason to reduce or eliminate her aid. The government was not just a safety net, it was an enforcer of cohabitation. Let us look at the data from the Bureau of Social Hygiene during the mid-1930s. Their research indicated that the divorce now trend was being suppressed by a massive increase in forced domesticity. When the government started distributing surplus commodities like flour, lard, and dried beans, they were distributed per household. A single person or a separated individual received significantly less than a family unit. This meant that splitting a household into two meant more than just doubling the rent. It meant having the food supply. In a period where malnutrition was a leading cause of childhood illness, no mother was going to trade her children's caloric intake for a divorce decree. This era also saw the professionalization of the marriage saver. Because the government wanted to keep relief costs down, they began to fund domestic relations courts and reconciliation clinics. The goal of these institutions was not to help couples find happiness, but to prevent them from becoming a burden on the state through divorce. If Michael and Sarah went to a city agency for help, they weren't met with a lawyer who could help them separate. They were met with a counselor whose job was to convince them to make it work for the sake of the economy. These counselors used a step-by-step process of financial shaming, reminding the husband of his duty as a provider and the wife of her duty as a domestic stabilizer. Step 1 was the budgetary analysis, where the counselor would show the couple that they literally could not afford to live in two separate places. Step 2 was the moral appeal, emphasizing that divorce was a luxury that the country, in its state of crisis, could not afford. Step 3 was the relief threat, subtly hinting that a failure to reconcile could result in a negative report to the relief office. This was a systematic, state-sponsored suppression of the divorce rate. It was stability achieved through the threat of starvation. We have to consider the long-term psychological fallout of this government-mandated proximity. When a state forces people to live in a state of hollow shell marriage, it creates a generation of children who grow up in homes defined by coldness, resentment, and underlying violence. The 1930s were not a time of strong family values, as often depicted in nostalgic media. They were a time of enforced family values. The data shows that as soon as the economy began to recover in the late 1930s and early 1940s with the onset of defense spending, the divorce rate began to climb almost instantly. This confirms that the low rates during the height of the Depression were an artificial suppression, a cork in a bottle that was about to pop. But there is another, even more disturbing layer to this divorce now trend, or the lack thereof. While the government was forcing the poor to stay together, it was also participating in a massive nationwide manhunt. The National Desertion Bureau became an unofficial arm of the social safety net. If a man like Michael finally snapped and left, the state didn't just let him go. They tracked him across state lines. Why? Not because they cared about the sanctity of the marriage, but because if they found him, they could force him to pay a few dollars a month, thereby reducing the amount the government had to pay in relief. This turned the American marriage into a legal and financial manhunt. The divorce now desire was being met with a pay now or stay now reality. This brings us to a critical turning point in our deep dive. We have seen how the law, the economy, and the government all conspired to lock the door on failing marriages. But what happened when the pressure became too much? What happened when invisible divorces turned into visible tragedies? In the next part, we are going to explore the dark underbelly of this trend, the rise of domestic accidents, and the unsolved disappearances of the 1930s. We will look at the case studies of couples who, when denied a legal exit by the state, found much more permanent and violent ways to end their unions. We will also examine the crisis of masculinity that occurred when millions of men realized they were legally bound to families they could not feed, leading to a national epidemic of what was then called poverty madness. If the government thought they could force a nation into happy families through a bag of flour, they were about to be proven wrong in the most public and painful way possible. To understand why the government's attempt to glue families together with welfare checks failed so spectacularly, we have to look at the psychological disintegration of the American male in the mid-1930s. In the cultural landscape of the time, a man's worth was not measured by his character or his kindness, but by his ability to provide a paycheck. When that paycheck vanished, the foundation of the marriage didn't just crack, it pulverized. This led to a phenomenon called poverty madness, a state of chronic high-tension despair that turned the family home into a psychological battlefield. If legal divorce was the unreachable exit, and government relief was the cage, then desertion became the only functional release valve for a masculine identity and total collapse. Imagine if you are living in the year 2026 and every single digital footprint you have, your social security number, your bank records, your GPS history was suddenly erased. In 1936, this wasn't a science fiction scenario. It was a daily reality for men who decided to become ghosts. To see how this worked, let us analyze the case study of a man we will call David, a former mid-level manager at a manufacturing plant in Ohio. David had lost his job in 1932. By 1936, he had spent 4 years living in a two-room apartment with a wife, Linda, who reminded him every morning that the children were wearing cardboard in their shoes because he was a failure. They were trapped in the invisible divorce. They hadn't shared a kind word in 48 months, but because they were on the relief rolls, they were legally and financially tethered. Historical trends indicate that for men like David, the pressure eventually hit a terminal velocity. The step-by-step process of a 1930s desertion was chillingly efficient. Step 1. David would wait for a morning when the tension was unbearable. Step 2. He would leave for a supposed job hunt, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and perhaps a single cherished tool or photograph. Step 3. He would head to the nearest rail yard. In the 1930s, the rails were the circulatory system of the American underground. By hopping a freight train, a man could be 3 states away by nightfall. Step 4. He would change his name. Without the modern biometric tracking of 2026, David Miller could become David Stone simply by saying so at a new boarding house. This was the poor man's divorce in its most raw form. But for the family left behind, the potential outcomes were catastrophic. Linda was now a deserted wife. Under the New Deal relief rules, a deserted wife was often treated with more suspicion than a widow. Social workers would grill Linda. Did he really leave? Are you hiding him in the attic to get an extra stipend? Are you seeing another man? The National Desertion Bureau, a real organization that operated during this time, became the most feared entity for runaway husbands. They published a gallery of missing husbands in local newspapers across the country. These were literal mugshots of men whose only crime was fleeing a marriage they could no longer afford. The data from the National Desertion Bureau shows a staggering spike in cases between 1934 and 1937. They were processing thousands of applications a month from wives trying to track down their vanished spouses. This wasn't just about love or reconciliation. It was about the legal right to sue for support. If the Bureau found David in California, they could have him arrested for non-support and extradited back to Ohio. Think about the insanity of that legal loop. The state would spend tax dollars to catch a man who had no money, bring him back to a home where he wasn't wanted, and demand he pay a debt he couldn't cover, all while the marriage itself was a rotting corpse. But there was an even darker side to the divorce now trend that the official statistics of the 1930s tried to bury. When desertion wasn't an option, and the relief office wouldn't let you separate, the pressure cooker of the household often exploded into what was then termed domestic accidents. Case studies from hospital records in New York and Detroit during 1936 show a suspicious rise in home-based injuries that modern sociologists now recognize as the fallout of enforced proximity. When two people who are legally prevented from divorcing are forced to compete for the last scrap of food in a cold room, violence becomes a tragic, frequent byproduct. This is where the concept of poverty madness truly takes hold. In 1936, the rate of admissions to state mental hospitals for men reached an all-time high. The diagnosis was often vague, melancholia or nervous exhaustion, but the underlying cause was the same: the total erasure of the provider role. A man who couldn't be a husband in the traditional sense, and who wasn't allowed to be a single man through divorce, simply broke. We see records of men who would sit in silence for weeks, staring at the walls of the tenements they shared with wives they despised, until they were eventually hauled away by the state. In a strange, horrific way, the mental asylum became the only free divorce the state would provide. Once a spouse was institutionalized, the other was legally allowed to claim a form of separation and receive relief as a single head of household. We must also examine the specific impact on the children of these hollow marriages. Imagine if in 2026, you grew up in a home where your parents never spoke, where the air was thick with a resentment so heavy you could feel it in your bones, but they never left because the government wouldn't let them. This created a generation of Americans who viewed marriage not as a romantic bond, but as a survival pact. The historical data suggests that children who grew up during the height of the Great Depression were actually more likely to delay their own marriages or, conversely, to rush into them as a way to escape their parents' toxic households. The divorce now trend of the 1930s didn't just affect the couples of that decade. It recalibrated the emotional DNA of the American family for the next 40 years. As we look at this through the lens of a deep dive masterclass, we have to ask, was there any escape for the average person? We've seen the wealthy flee to Reno, and we've seen the poor flee to the rail yards. But what about the middle class? Those who had a little bit of property, a tiny bit of dignity, but not enough cash for a Nevada divorce ranch? They were the ones who truly suffered under the weight of the invisible divorce. They were the ones who maintained the facade of the happy American family for the cameras of the Farm Security Administration, while behind closed doors, they were negotiating the terms of their own mutual misery. The potential outcomes of this era were a society built on a lie. The low divorce rates of 1932 to 1938 are often cited by modern traditionalists as a sign of a more stable time. But the reality, as we have seen, was a nation of people who were legally kidnapped by their own poverty. The government's intervention through the New Deal provided the calories to stay alive, but it didn't provide the legal or social infrastructure to stay sane. It treated the family as a unit of production, rather than a collection of human beings with emotional needs. So, how did this finally break? What was the catalyst that finally allowed the divorce now trend to move from a hidden, simmering resentment into a full-blown social revolution? It wasn't a change in the law, and it wasn't a sudden burst of national morality. It was something much more violent and much more global. As the shadow of World War II began to loom over the United States, the economic gears of the country began to turn again. Suddenly, for the first time in a decade, people had money in their pockets. And the very first thing thousands of them decided to buy with that new money wasn't a new car or a radio. In the next part, we are going to explore the great uncoupling of 1939 and 1940. We will see how the sudden influx of defense industry jobs acted like a universal key, unlocking the doors of millions of miserable households. We will look at the specific data points that show a direct correlation between the first manufacturing boom and a vertical spike in divorce filings. If you thought the Great Depression was the end of the story, wait until you see what happened when the American public finally had the cash to say goodbye. The Reno cure was about to go mainstream, and the results would change the American legal system forever. By 1939, the atmospheric pressure within the American home had reached its absolute limit. The economic engine of the United States, which had been stalling for nearly a decade, began to cough back to life as the shadow of conflict in Europe and Asia spurred a massive industrial mobilization. This was the moment the invisible divorce finally became visible. For years, couples had been living in a state of domestic paralysis, held together not by affection or shared values, but by the cold, hard fact that neither party could afford the cost of a legal exit or the subsequent expense of a second household. But as the first defense contracts began to pour into cities like Detroit, Seattle, and Baltimore, the financial chains began to snap. This period marks the transition from the Great Depression to what historians often call the Great Uncoupling. To understand the mechanics of this surge, we have to look at the sudden democratization of the escape fund. In the mid-1930s, saving $50 for a divorce filing was an impossible dream for a family living on relief. By 1940, however, the expansion of manufacturing jobs provided a new kind of social mobility. Let us look at a case study of a woman we will call Mary, living in a suburb of Los Angeles in 1940. Mary had spent the last 8 years in a marriage that had functionally ended during the bank panics of 1932. Her husband had become increasingly distant and resentful of their shared poverty. For nearly a decade, they had occupied the same four walls in a state of icy silence. But in 1940, Mary secured a job as a clerk at a burgeoning aerospace plant. For the first time in her adult life, she had a paycheck that was issued in her name, not her husband's. Imagine if you are living in the year 2026, and you have been trapped in a toxic living situation for years because your credit score was destroyed and you had zero liquid assets. Suddenly, a new industry emerges that is so desperate for labor that they offer you a signing bonus and a steady, high-wage salary regardless of your past. That is exactly what the defense boom felt like for the trapped spouses of the late Depression. For Mary, that paycheck was more than just money for groceries. It was the purchase price of her freedom. Historical trends during this specific 2-year window show a direct, vertical correlation between the rise in female labor participation and the spike in divorce filings in urban industrial centers. The divorce now trend was no longer a desperate whisper. It was a roar in the municipal courtrooms. The step-by-step process of this uncoupling was a fascinating display of economic cause and effect. Step 1. The accumulation of the retainer. Throughout 1939, we see a trend of people opening individual savings accounts, often hidden from their spouses. This was the preparation phase. Step 2. The legal consultation. Attorneys who had spent the last decade barely scraping by on small-scale debt collection suddenly found their offices flooded with men and women ready to pay for a decree. Step 3. The filing. Because the courts had been relatively quiet regarding divorce for 10 years, there was a massive backlog. In 1940, the average wait time for a divorce hearing in some U.S. counties tripled because the volume of people seeking to end their hollow shell marriages was unprecedented. We must also analyze the Reno cure going mainstream during this recovery phase. While Reno had been the playground of the wealthy during the 1920s and the early Depression, the sudden influx of cash into the middle class made the 6-week Nevada residency accessible to a much broader demographic. Nevada's laws remained the most liberal in the country, and by 1940, the divorce ranches of Reno were no longer just for socialites. They were filled with schoolteachers, foremen, and office managers who could finally afford the train ticket and the 6 weeks of boarding. This created a unique social phenomenon where Reno became a sort of purgatory for the American middle class. A place where the misery of the 1930s was officially washed away before they returned to their home states as single individuals ready to participate in the new wartime economy. The data points from 1940 are staggering. In many jurisdictions, the divorce rate jumped by as much as 20% in a single year. This wasn't because people suddenly became less moral or because the concept of family collapsed. It was because the economic barrier to divorce had been lowered to the point where it no longer outweighed the psychological cost of staying. The potential outcomes of this shift were profound. As people separated, they began to move. This fueled a secondary boom in the housing market, specifically in boarding houses and small apartments, as the single household unit became a growing segment of the American population. Furthermore, we have to consider the role of the government's shift in rhetoric. During the height of the New Deal, the government emphasized the family unit as the bedrock of stability. But as the nation moved toward a war footing, the emphasis shifted to individual productivity. The government needed workers who were mobile, focused, and capable of working long hours in factories. A worker who was distracted by a volatile, high-conflict domestic situation was less efficient than one who had achieved a clean break. While the state didn't explicitly encourage divorce, the social stigma began to soften as the national priority shifted from domestic preservation to industrial output. This period also saw the rise of the migratory worker, which facilitated the final breakdown of many Depression-era marriages. When a man left a struggling farm in Oklahoma to find work in a shipyard in Virginia, the distance often provided the final push toward a legal separation. The physical distance made the invisible divorce an undeniable reality. Thousands of couples who had been pretending to be married for the sake of the relief office found that once they were separated by 1,000 miles, the pretense was no longer worth the effort. The mail became the primary medium for the dissolution of the American family, with divorce papers crossing the country in stamped envelopes. However, we must add another layer of value to this analysis by looking at the specific legal shifts that occurred during this recovery. As the demand for divorce increased, many states began to realize that their archaic fault-based laws were out of sync with the new economic reality. While no-fault divorce was still decades away, judges in 1940 began to interpret cruelty and desertion much more broadly. They saw the human toll the Depression had taken, and they began to use the legal system as a release valve for the nation's collective domestic trauma. They understood that for the country to move forward into the challenges of the 1940s, it needed to clear the wreckage of the 1930s. The Great Uncoupling was the final act of the Great Depression's impact on the family. It was the moment the pressure cooker finally whistled. We have seen how the defense boom provided the funds, how Reno provided the venue, and how the courts provided the mechanism. But as these millions of newly single Americans looked toward the future, they were about to enter a world that would ask even more of them. They were stepping out of failed marriages and into a global conflict that would redefine the American family yet again. But what happens when the freedom you just bought with your first defense paycheck is immediately met with a new kind of pressure? What happens when the surge in divorces is met with a surge in impulsive, high-stakes war marriages? The uncoupling of 1940 was about to be followed by the most volatile period of domestic history the United States had ever seen. In the next part, we are going to dive into the phenomenon of the war brides and the 1946 divorce peak. We will analyze how the psychological scars of the Great Depression led to a frantic search for security that resulted in millions of doomed from the start unions. We will look at the data that shows why the biggest spike in divorce didn't happen during the Depression, but exactly 1 year after it was officially over. If you thought the divorce now trend was a 1930s story, wait until you see the carnage of 1946. The year 1946 stands as a monolith in the history of American domesticity, marking the single greatest spike in divorce rates the United States had ever seen up to that point. To understand why this happened, we have to look at the psychological residue of the Great Depression. The 1930s had taught a generation of Americans that security was the only currency that mattered. This obsession with safety led to a phenomenon called the haste of 1941. As the country transitioned from the breadlines of the Depression to the assembly lines of the war effort, millions of young people who had been deprived of emotional and financial stability for a decade rushed into what historians call furlough weddings. These were marriages built on a foundation of shadow and scarcity, often consummated after only a few days of knowing one another. Imagine if you are living in the year 2026 and you have just endured 10 years of extreme economic isolation and restricted movement. Suddenly, you are told you are being sent to a global conflict halfway across the world. But for the first time in your life, you have a steady paycheck from the government. The psychological impulse is to anchor yourself to something, anything before you leave. In the early 1940s, that anchor was marriage. But these were not the companionate marriages of the 1920s. They were panic marriages born from the trauma of the 1930s. When the war ended in 1945, and the reality of 1946 set in, the divorce now trend that had been simmering since the 1929 crash finally reached a boiling point. Let us analyze the case study of a veteran we will call Robert and his wife Susan. They married in late 1941, just as Robert was being drafted. Susan had spent the 1930s watching her parents lose their farm and live in a state of perpetual invisible divorce because they couldn't afford to split. To Susan, Robert represented an escape from the stagnation of the Depression. To Robert, Susan was the idealized image of the home he was fighting for. But for the 4 years Robert was in the Pacific, Susan was undergoing a radical transformation. She moved to a city, took a job in a munitions factory, and for the first time in her life, she was economically autonomous. She was no longer the desperate girl from the farm. She was a woman who had navigated the tail end of a global crisis and a world war on her own terms. When Robert returned in 1946, he walked into a home where the woman he married no longer existed. The psychological distance created by 4 years of war was compounded by the 10 years of deprivation that preceded it. Robert wanted the quiet, submissive household of his childhood, the one his mother had maintained through the 1930s out of sheer necessity. Susan, having tasted the freedom that a paycheck provides, refused to go back to a state of domestic dependence. This was the collision point for millions of Americans. Historical trends show that in 1946, there were 18.2 divorces for every 1,000 married couples. To put that in perspective, that rate was nearly double the rate seen during the peak of the 1920s and triple the suppressed rates of the mid-1930s. The step-by-step collapse of the 1946 household was driven by a new economic reality: the availability of the goodbye fund. Unlike the 1930s, where the lack of cash was the primary barrier to legal separation, 1946 was a year of relative liquidity. Returning soldiers had years of accumulated back pay and mustering out checks. Women like Susan had 4 years of war bond savings. For the first time in 16 years, both halves of a failing marriage had the literal cash in hand to pay a lawyer. The divorce now trend moved from a dream to a transaction. Step 1 of this process was the unveiling. Veterans returned to find that their wives had developed independent social lives, bank accounts, and political opinions. Step 2 was the confrontation of trauma. The men who had survived the war were often suffering from what we now call PTSD, but back then it was simply termed combat exhaustion. They were returning to women who were suffering from depression fatigue. The two sets of trauma did not harmonize, they clashed. Step 3 was the legal surge. In 1946, divorce courts were so overwhelmed that they began to operate like assembly lines. In cities like Reno, which we discussed earlier, the 6-week cure became so popular that hotels had to set up cots in the hallways to accommodate the influx of people from the East Coast who were finally finishing the divorces they had wanted to start in 1935. We must also look at the specific data regarding the duration of marriage during this peak. The vast majority of the 1946 divorces were not from couples who had been together for 20 years. They were from the war marriages that had lasted less than 5 years. However, a significant percentage of those filings were also the old business of the Great Depression. These were the couples who had been living in hollow shells since 1932, waiting for the moment they could afford to leave. When the post-war boom hit, these older couples joined the younger generation in the breadlines of the courthouse. The 1946 spike was a massive clearing of the domestic ledger for the entire United States. Potential outcomes for these newly single individuals were surprisingly different than they had been in the 1930s. In the 1930s, a divorce often meant a slide into deeper poverty. In 1946, the booming post-war economy meant that a single man or woman could actually find a studio apartment and a job. The economic cage had been dismantled. This led to a brief but intense period of social experimentation. For a window of about 18 months, the divorce now trend was the dominant cultural narrative in America. Magazines were filled with articles on the veterans' divorce and how to rebuild after the split. The country was effectively purging the misery of the previous decade and a half. But this period of openness was short-lived. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the United States witnessed one of the most aggressive cultural pivots in history. The chaos of 1946, with its record-breaking divorce rates and domestic instability, terrified the American establishment. The potential outcomes of a society of single, mobile, and autonomous individuals were seen as a threat to national security in the burgeoning Cold War. This led to the creation of the nuclear family propaganda machine. The 1950s ideal of the perfect home with a white picket fence was not a natural evolution of American values. It was a desperate, manufactured reaction to the divorce-now carnage of 1946. As we dive deeper into this masterclass, we have to recognize that the invisible divorce of the 1930s didn't just end. It evolved. The people who got divorced in 1946 were the pioneers of a new kind of American identity, but they were about to be silenced by a decade of forced domesticity. We have analyzed the cash, the trauma, and the haste. Now we must look at the counter-revolution. What happens when a government sees its citizens choosing freedom over the family unit and decides to spend billions of dollars to convince them that their only path to happiness is back in the kitchen? How did the divorce now trend of the Depression lead directly to the stay-at-home mandates of the 1950s? In the next part, we are going to explore the Great Domestic Re-education and the rise of the suburbs as a tool for marital containment. We will look at how the GI Bill, while helping veterans, was specifically structured to favor married couples, effectively taxing the single life out of existence. The invisible divorce was about to be replaced by the suburban prison, and the results would set the stage for the social explosions of the 1960s. The counter-revolution that followed the divorce spike of 1946 was not a spontaneous return to traditional values, but a calculated, government-subsidized lockdown of the American family. To understand how the divorce now trend of the Great Depression was finally suppressed, we have to look at the construction of the suburban cage. Between 1947 and 1952, the United States government engaged in the largest social engineering project in its history. The goal was simple: stabilize the economy by anchoring the restless, post-war population into 30-year mortgage contracts. This was achieved primarily through the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill, and the subsequent policies of the Federal Housing Administration. Imagine if you are living in the year 2026 and the government announces a new stimulus program that offers you a luxury home for 0% down, but there is a hidden clause. The home is located 30 miles from any major city, there is no public transportation, and the tax benefits only apply if you remain legally married to your current spouse. If you divorce, the interest rate triples and you lose your health care. This is the modern equivalent of the bargain struck by millions of Americans in the late 1940s. The invisible divorce of the 1930s, which was caused by a lack of money, was replaced by the suburban containment, where staying together became the only way to access the middle class. Historical trends during this period show that the GI Bill was effectively a marriage subsidy program. While the law didn't explicitly state you had to be married to receive a home loan, the underwriting criteria of the FHA and the Veterans Administration were heavily biased toward the traditional family unit. A single veteran or a divorced man was seen as a flight risk, unstable and immature. A married man with a wife and 2 children was the ideal debtor. He was less likely to quit his job, less likely to move, and most importantly, less likely to risk his family's roof by filing for divorce. The state was not just building houses, it was building a social structure that made the divorce now impulse economically suicidal. Let us analyze a case study of a couple we will call John and Helen. In 1946, they were on the brink of separation. John had returned from Europe a different man, and Helen had found independence working in a factory during the war. They were part of the statistical surge in divorce filings. But in 1948, John was offered a chance to buy a home in one of the new Levittown developments for a fraction of what they were paying in rent for their cramped city apartment. To Helen, who remembered the cold tenements of the 1930s, this was the ultimate security. They moved to the suburbs, not because their emotional issues were resolved, but because the government had made the exit price of their marriage too high to pay. The step-by-step process of suburban containment functioned through the geography of isolation. Step 1: the relocation. By moving millions of people from dense urban centers to isolated suburban plots, the government broke the traditional support networks of the extended family. In the 1930s, a struggling wife could often lean on her mother or sisters living just blocks away. In the suburbs of 1950, Helen was miles away from her nearest relative. Step 2: the car dependency. These new developments were designed without sidewalks or public transit. Since John took the only car to work every day, Helen was effectively housebound. This physical isolation made the idea of a divorce now move impossible. Where would she go? How would she get there? Step 3: the consumer debt trap. To fill these new, larger homes, couples were encouraged to buy on credit: refrigerators, washing machines, televisions. The American family was now a unit of consumption, and a divorce meant a total liquidation of that life. Data from the Federal Reserve during this period shows that household debt in the United States skyrocketed from $5 billion in 1945 to $20 billion by 1950. This debt acted as a new kind of alimony. In the 1930s, people stayed together because they had no money. In the 1950s, they stayed together because they owed too much money. The invisible divorce was back, but this time it was hidden behind a white picket fence. The potential outcomes for people like John and Helen were a state of suburban neurosis. They lived in a beautiful home. They had all the modern conveniences their parents only dreamed of during the Depression, but the internal void remained. We must also look at the role of the Great Domestic Re-education. As the 1950s progressed, the media became an enforcer of this new domesticity. Magazines that had praised Rosie the Riveter in 1943 were now publishing articles about the shame of the divorced woman. Educational films and high school curriculums emphasized that a woman's highest calling was to be a homemaker, a term that essentially meant an unpaid manager of a government-subsidized domestic unit. The divorce now trend was rebranded as a psychiatric disorder. A woman who wanted to leave a stable, suburban marriage was told she was maladjusted or neurotic. Case studies from the early 1950s show a massive spike in women seeking medical help for vague anxieties. They weren't suffering from the poverty madness of the breadlines. They were suffering from the golden cage of the suburbs. But the solution offered by the medical establishment wasn't a divorce decree. It was a prescription. This is the moment where the history of American divorce takes a dark, chemical turn. The state had used architecture and debt to trap the family, and now the medical industry would use chemistry to keep them there. As we look at this through our deep dive masterclass lens, we can see that the stability of the 1950s was a fragile illusion. The low divorce rates were an artificial result of massive state intervention in the housing and credit markets. The government had successfully locked the American family into a specific economic model to ensure a stable workforce for the Cold War. But you cannot suppress the human desire for autonomy forever. The invisible divorces of the suburbs were creating a pressure that no amount of consumer goods could alleviate. But how do you maintain a marriage when the silence in the living room becomes deafening? How did the pharmaceutical industry step in to bridge the gap between a failing relationship and a 30-year mortgage? In the next part, we are going to explore the rise of Mother's Little Helper and the era of the sedated divorce. We will analyze the data on the massive rise in tranquilizer use among suburban women and how the medicalization of unhappiness became the final tool for the suppression of the divorce now trend. If you think the suburban cage was a prison, wait until you see the chemical bars that were built inside the medicine cabinet. The true cost of staying for the sake of the economy was about to be measured in milligrams. The year 1955 marked the beginning of a pharmacological revolution that would serve as the final lock on the suburban cage. To understand how the divorce now trend of the Great Depression was successfully suppressed for an entire generation, we must look at the transition from physical hunger to chemical compliance. In the 1930s, couples were held together by the cold reality of an empty stomach and a lack of a legal exit fee. By the mid-1950s, the economic barriers had been replaced by a new, more subtle form of containment, the minor tranquilizer. This was the era of the anesthetized marriage, where the psychological trauma of the Depression met the clinical solution of the pharmaceutical industry. Imagine if you are living in the year 2026, and instead of dealing with the deteriorating domestic situation through communication or legal separation, your primary interaction with the world is filtered through a high-performance algorithm designed to keep your mood perfectly level. In 1955, that algorithm was a pill called Miltown. Miltown, the brand name for meprobamate, was the first blockbuster psychotropic drug in American history. It wasn't marketed to the severely mentally ill in asylums. It was marketed directly to the stressed-out inhabitants of the new American suburbs. Specifically, it was marketed to the millions of women who, like our character Helen from the previous part, were finding that the white picket fence felt more like a set of bars. Historical trends indicate that the pharmaceutical industry recognized a massive market in the domestic dissatisfaction that had been simmering since the end of the war. Case studies from medical journals in the late 1950s show a startling pattern. Doctors were being coached to view a woman's desire for autonomy or her frustration with a hollow shell marriage not as a valid social response, but as a medical condition called anxiety. If a woman in 1932 complained about her marriage, she was told she was lucky to have a husband with a job. If a woman in 1957 complained about her marriage, she was given a prescription. This was the birth of the chemical divorce, a state where the couple remained legally and physically together, but were mentally and emotionally miles apart, buffered by a layer of meprobamate. Let us analyze the step-by-step medicalization of domestic unhappiness that occurred during this period. Step 1 was the consultation. A woman would visit her family physician complaining of nerves or suburban sadness. Step 2 was the diagnosis. Instead of exploring the socioeconomic traps of the GI Bill or the lack of career opportunities for women, the doctor would categorize the unhappiness as a personal internal failure of the nervous system. Step 3 was the maintenance of the status quo. The primary goal of the medication was not to solve the underlying marital conflict, but to make the patient well enough to continue performing her duties as a wife and mother. Miltown was literally marketed as the drug that helped women accept their roles. The data behind this trend is staggering. By 1956, just 1 year after its release, Miltown was the most prescribed drug in the United States. 1 out of every 20 Americans was taking it regularly. In some suburban enclaves, that number was estimated to be as high as 1 in 3 for adult women. This massive chemical intervention acted as a social stabilizer. It effectively lowered the divorce rate by numbing the population to the very reasons they wanted to divorce in the first place. The divorce now impulse was being chemically suppressed to ensure the economic unit of the family remained intact to pay off that 30-year mortgage we discussed. Furthermore, we must look at the specific marketing tactics used to reinforce this chemical cage. Advertisements in the Journal of the American Medical Association during this era frequently depicted a distraught housewife standing in a modern kitchen, with copy that suggested the drug could help her tolerate the routine of her life. This was a direct response to the invisible divorce phenomenon. The government and the private sector both realized that if the suburban family unit collapsed, the entire post-war economic boom, built on the sale of appliances, cars, and home goods, would collapse with it. The pharmaceutical industry provided the chemical glue that the New Deal's flour bags couldn't quite provide. We should also consider the potential outcomes of this widespread sedation. While the divorce rate remained artificially low throughout the 1950s, the internal decay of the American family was reaching a critical mass. This period saw a rise in what sociologists call passive-aggressive domesticity. Since the husband was often also being pressured by the organization man culture of the 1950s, he too was often prescribed tranquilizers or turned to heavy evening drinking, the legendary 3-martini lunch. This created a generation of households where both parents were functionally sedated, creating a bizarre, quiet, and deeply repressed environment for the children of the era. Imagine the imagine-if scenario for 2026 again. Imagine a society where every conflict is resolved by a digital dose of dopamine, preventing any social or personal change from ever occurring. That was the American suburb in 1958. The invisible divorce had evolved into the sedated stalemate. People weren't staying together because they loved each other. They were staying together because they lacked the emotional energy to fight, let alone leave. The economic prison of the 1930s had become a chemical prison in the 1950s, and the price of entry was your very sense of self. But there was a ticking clock on this pharmacological solution. You cannot medicate an entire population into permanent submission without eventually facing a backlash. As the 1950s drew to a close, a new generation was coming of age, one that had witnessed the hollow shell marriages of their parents, both the hungry ones of the 30s and the sedated ones of the 50s. They were starting to ask questions that the pharmaceutical industry couldn't answer. They were looking at the divorce now trend not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a form of liberation that had been stolen from their parents. As we dive deeper into this masterclass, we have to recognize that the 1950s were not a time of peace, but a time of Cold War domesticity. The suppression of the divorce rate was a matter of national policy, supported by architecture, debt, and chemistry. But the human spirit is remarkably resistant to permanent sedation. The very tools used to keep the family together, the education of women, the rising standard of living, and even the pills themselves, were about to become the catalyst for the most explosive era of divorce in human history. What happens when the mother's little helper stops working? What happens when a new kind of pill, not for sedation but for liberation, enters the scene? In the next part, we are going to explore the intersection of the sexual revolution and the no-fault divorce movement. We will analyze the data that shows how the invention of the contraceptive pill in 1960 acted as the ultimate detonator for the suburban cage. We will look at how the invisible divorces of the previous 30 years finally flooded the courtrooms in a tidal wave that the legal system was forced to acknowledge. If the Great Depression was the beginning of the divorce now desire, the 1960s were the beginning of the divorce now reality. The cage was about to be ripped open from the inside out. By the time the calendar turned to 1960, the psychological foundation of the American family was a series of tectonic plates under immense, unaligned pressure. To truly master the history of the divorce now trend, We must look at the 1960s not as a decade of random rebellion, but as the inevitable chemical and legal reaction to the domestic containment policies born in the Great Depression and refined in the suburbs. The invisible divorce of the 1930s, that state of being legally bound but emotionally severed due to lack of funds, had been passed down like a hereditary trauma to the children of the breadlines. These children, now adults in their 30s and 40s, were the ones who finally took a sledgehammer to the suburban cage. Imagine if you are living in the year 2026 and every legal contract you have ever signed, your mortgage, your employment agreement, your marriage license, was suddenly subject to a one-click delete option provided by a new federal software update. In the late 1960s, that software update was called no-fault divorce. But before the law changed, the culture had to break. To understand this step-by-step breakdown, let us analyze the case study of a woman we will call Linda, born in 1932. Linda was a child of the Depression who watched her mother, Sarah, hide her father's desertion from the social workers to keep their relief check. Linda grew up believing that marriage was a survival bunker, not a partnership. By 1965, Linda was living in a beautiful home in Connecticut with 3 children and a husband she hadn't had a meaningful conversation with since the Eisenhower administration. Linda was the embodiment of the suppressed divorce now trend. She was part of the statistical anomaly of the 1950s, the low divorce rate that historians once pointed to as a sign of moral health, but which we now know was a result of the chemical sedation and economic locks we explored in the previous parts. Historical trends indicate that by 1966, the effectiveness of Mother's Little Helper was wearing off. The internal resentment that had been frozen since the 1930s began to thaw in the heat of the second-wave feminist movement. For Linda, the catalyst wasn't just a book like The Feminine Mystique. It was the realization that the economic barriers that had trapped her mother were finally dissolving. The first major blow to the invisible divorce was the second wave of women entering the workforce in the mid-1960s. Unlike the temporary factory jobs of World War II, these were permanent shifts in the American labor landscape. As more women like Linda began to find employment in the burgeoning service and professional sectors, the welfare lock we discussed in Part 3 was finally picked. When a woman has her own bank account and her own Social Security contributions, the threat of the poorhouse loses its teeth. Data from the U.S. Department of Labor shows that female labor force participation jumped from 34% in 1950 to over 43% by 1970. This 9% shift represented millions of exit funds being built in secret. But the most significant legal explosion, the one that officially ended the era of the Great Depression's domestic ghosting, happened in California in 1969. To understand the depth of this shift, we have to look at the signing of the Family Law Act by then-Governor Ronald Reagan. This was the first no-fault divorce law in the United States. It was the total destruction of the staged adultery and proving cruelty industry that had made divorce a luxury for the wealthy since 1929. Step 1 of this revolution was the removal of the need for a villain. You no longer had to hire a photographer to catch your husband in a hotel room. Step 2 was the legal recognition of irreconcilable differences. The state finally admitted that a marriage could die of natural causes, or rather, from the long-term starvation of the 1930s and the sedation of the 1950s. Step 3 was the tidal wave. Once California opened the gates, the divorce now desire that had been bottled up for 40 years flooded the courtrooms. The potential outcomes were immediate and shocking to the national psyche. Between 1960 and 1980, the divorce rate in the United States more than doubled. This wasn't a sign that people suddenly hated each other more. It was the clearing of a 40-year backlog. We are looking at the legal dissolution of marriages that had functionally ended in 1935, 1948, and 1955. The 1970s was the decade where America finally settled its domestic debts from the Great Depression. Let us look at the data from the 1974 peak. For the first time in the history of the United States, more marriages ended in divorce than in death. This is a monumental data point. For the entire history of the country prior to this, the till death do us part clause was largely enforced by biology and poverty. By 1974, the combination of no-fault laws and female economic autonomy had made divorce the primary ending for the American Union. The invisible divorce was dead. In its place was the visible divorce, a social phenomenon that redefined the American landscape, leading to the rise of the single-parent household and the blended family. We must also analyze the role of the 1960s contraceptive revolution in this trend. While we often view the pill through the lens of the sexual revolution, its impact on the divorce now trend was purely economic and structural. By allowing women to decouple sex from procreation, it allowed them to decouple their long-term economic security from a single male provider. If a woman like Linda could control the size of her family, she could control her ability to work, and therefore her ability to leave. The pill was the ultimate anti-poverty tool, providing a layer of protection that the New Deal never could. It was the final key that unlocked the suburban cage. However, we must add another layer of value to this analysis by looking at the specific impact on the men of the Depression. The men who had been raised to believe that their only value was the paycheck, those who suffered the poverty madness we discussed in Part 4, found themselves completely lost in the 1970s. As their wives exercised their new legal and economic freedoms, many of these men experienced a second crisis of masculinity. The divorce now trend of the 70s was, in many ways, a delayed reaction to the failures of the 1930s patriarch. The man who couldn't provide in 1932 was being divorced by the woman who no longer needed him to provide in 1972. This deep dive shows us that the stability of the mid-20th century was a myth maintained by the high cost of the exit. Once the cost dropped, the reality was revealed. We see this in the massive spike in gray divorce. Older couples who had stayed together for 30 or 40 years, finally splitting up once their children were grown and the laws had changed. These were the survivors of the Great Depression, finally claiming the autonomy they were denied during the breadlines. As we look toward the final part of this masterclass, we have to ask, what is the legacy of this century-long struggle between economic necessity and personal freedom? We have tracked the trend from the poor man's divorce of the 1930s to the chemical cage of the 1950s, and the no-fault revolution of the 1970s. But where are we now? And more importantly, how does the history of the 1930s inform the domestic choices of Americans in the high inflation, high uncertainty world of the 2020s? In the final part, we are going to synthesize everything we have learned. We will look at the modern invisible divorce of the 2020s, the couples who are cohabitating today because of high interest rates and student debt, echoing the patterns of 1932. We will analyze the cyclical nature of economic domesticity and provide the final deep dive, conclusions on how to recognize when history is repeating itself in your own living room. The divorce now trend isn't just a story of the past. It is a blueprint for the present. Are we currently living in a new Great Depression of the heart? The data suggests the answer might be more familiar than you think. As we transition our focus from the black and white archives of the 1930s to the high-definition complexity of the current year 2026, the parallels are not just striking, they are foundational. We have spent this masterclass analyzing how the Great Depression created a state of domestic paralysis, where the cost of a legal exit was so high that marriage became a forced economic cooperative. Today, in 2026, we are witnessing the emergence of the invisible divorce 2.0. While we no longer have the same archaic fault-based laws of 1932, we have developed a new set of digital and financial shackles that are producing the exact same historical trends. To understand the future of the American family, we must analyze the modern economic cage through the lens of housing inventory, interest rate traps, and the total surveillance of the credit score. Imagine if you are living in 2026 and you are part of a couple we will call Alex and Jordan. They live in a major U.S. metropolitan area, perhaps Austin or Charlotte. They have been married for 7 years, but for the last 3, the relationship has been a hollow shell. They have different social circles, they sleep in separate rooms, and they only speak to coordinate the logistics of their children's schedules. In 1932, Sarah and Michael stayed together because of the price of a bag of flour. In 2026, Alex and Jordan stay together because of a 3% fixed-rate mortgage. If they were to divorce now and sell the home, they would be forced to split the equity and enter a rental market where the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment exceeds their current monthly mortgage payment for a 4-bedroom house. Furthermore, if they were to try to buy individual homes, they would be facing interest rates near 8%. This is the modern breadline. It is a state of asset-based cohabitation where the potential outcomes of leaving are so financially devastating that the couples choose to remain in a state of psychological desertion. Historical trends indicate that when the cost of living outpaces wage growth, marital velocity, the speed at which failing relationships dissolve slows to a crawl. We can look at the data from the mid-2020s and see a direct correlation to the 1930s. Step 1 of this modern invisible divorce is the financial audit. In 1934, this was done at the kitchen table with a pencil. In 2026, it is done through an app that aggregates student loans, car payments, and the soaring cost of health insurance. When Alex and Jordan look at the step-by-step cost of a second household, the double utility bills, the loss of shared insurance premiums, and the legal retainers, they realize that freedom has a price tag of roughly $40,000 in liquid cash. For a generation that has lived through a decade of high inflation, that $40,000 is as unreachable as the $500 Reno cure was for a factory worker in 1935. We must also analyze the evolution of the credit score as the modern equivalent of the 1930s desertion bureau. During the Great Depression, a man could hop a train, change his name, and start a new life. In 2026, your financial identity is your biological identity. If Jordan leaves Alex, Jordan's credit score is tied to the joint debts they accrued together. If the divorce turns high conflict and assets are frozen, both parties see their ability to rent an apartment, buy a vehicle, or even secure certain types of employment evaporate in real time. The state no longer needs to publish a gallery of missing husbands in the newspaper because the digital footprint makes everyone findable. This creates a psychological pressure cooker where the fear of financial erasure replaces the fear of social stigma. This brings us to the phenomenon of the roommate marriage. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 show a massive rise in couples who have filed for legal separation, but continue to live under the same roof for 3, 5, or even 10 years. This is the 2026 version of the border phenomenon we discussed in Part 2. Instead of taking in a stranger to pay the rent, the estranged spouse becomes the border. They navigate the hallway like ghosts, using a shared Venmo account to split the cost of the high-speed internet and the grocery delivery. The potential outcomes of this enforced proximity are identical to those of the 1930s. A spike in domestic volatility, a generation of children raised in homes devoid of affection, and a national epidemic of what we can now call digital-era poverty madness. Let us look at the step-by-step breakdown of how this affects the 2026 labor market. Just as the New Deal relief programs were tied to a suitable home, modern corporate benefits are often structured around the family unit. When Alex considers leaving, Alex has to consider the loss of Jordan's superior dental and vision coverage. In a high-inflation environment, these are not luxuries, they are survival tools. The economic cage has become more sophisticated, but the bars are just as strong. We are seeing a trend where the U.S. public is prioritizing caloric and medical security over emotional autonomy, a direct echo of the 1930s survival pact. However, there is a crucial difference in the 2026 trend: the role of remote work. In the 1930s, you were tethered to your geographic location by your job. Today, you are tethered to your spouse by your shared home office. We are seeing case studies of couples who share a single high-speed connection, working for different companies in different rooms. While they negotiate the terms of a divorce they know they can't afford to finalize. This is the ultimate deep dive into the irony of modern freedom. We have the technology to work from anywhere, but we don't have the equity to live anywhere else. As we conclude this masterclass, the final takeaway is that the divorce now trend of the Great Depression never truly ended. It just went into a period of high liquidity hibernation during the late 20th century. Now that the era of cheap credit and low inflation has ended, the American family is returning to its 1930s roots as a unit of economic survival rather than a unit of personal fulfillment. We have analyzed the cash, the trauma, the chemistry, and the legal revolutions. We have seen how the government used flour in 1935 and mortgages in 1950 to keep families in place. Today, the tools are different: digital identity, subscription-based living, and asset lock. But the result is the same: a nation of hollow shells. The history of the Great Depression tells us that this pressure cannot be maintained indefinitely. In 1941, it took a global war to break the economic chains of the American household. In 1969, it took a social revolution. As we stand in 2026, we have to ask, what will be the catalyst that breaks the current domestic stalemate? Will it be a total collapse of the housing market, a radical shift in how we view digital identity, or a new legal framework that acknowledges the reality of the roommate marriage? The data we have analyzed suggests that we are at the end of a very long cycle. The invisible divorces of today are the seeds of the social explosions of tomorrow. If you are currently navigating a household that feels more like a survival bunker than a home, remember that you are part of a century-long historical trend. You are walking the same hallways as James and Martha, Sarah and Michael, and John and Helen. The economy has always been the third party in every American marriage. But the story doesn't end here. While we have mastered the history of the divorce now trend, a new trend is emerging on the horizon, one that challenges the very definition of what a household is in the 21st century. As the nuclear family structure continues to buckle under economic weight, A radical new form of communal living is taking root across the United States, and it looks nothing like the suburbs. In our next deep dive series, we are going to explore the rise of the neo-tribal household and the end of the single-family dream. We will look at the data on multi-generational co-living, the legal battles over zoning laws, and how the survivors of the 2026 economic cage are reinventing the American home from the ground up. If the Great Depression taught us how to stay together out of fear, the next decade might teach us how to live together out of necessity. The cycle is turning again, and the next part of the story is about to begin.